Hi, this is Gikollias. Welcome to the Gikollias podcast, where we will be talking about art, philosophy, literature, and all things classical Greek. In today's episode, we'll be talking about the tragedy by Euripides, Iphigenia among the Taurians. Our topic today is Iphigenia among the Taurians, Iphigenia in the land of the Taurians, which is one of the two tragedies written by Euripides with Iphigenia, the name of Iphigenia in the title. The other is Iphigenia in Aulis, and this takes us directly to the mythological background of the play, because the story of Aulis is as follows. The fleet of the Greeks, the famous 1,000 ships, are gathered in Aulis, ready to set sail for Troy to conquer the city. However, there is a strong adverse wind that will not abate, so the ships cannot depart. The seer Calchas informs Agamemnon that the reason for this is that the goddess Artemis is angry with him and exact justification for her wrath changes in different versions of the myth, but the fact remains that Artemis is angry with Agamemnon and she expects him to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia if the fleet is to set sail. Agamemnon agrees, he slaughters Iphigenia himself, and a favourable wind blows to take the ships of the Greeks to Troy. Now, it is very interesting that this is a myth that Homer, the poet of the Iliad, does not know. And I say that he doesn't know it for two reasons. First is that no one ever mentions it in Iliad. No one says in Iliad, oh, do you remember what tough time we had in Aulis when our leader had to sacrifice his own daughter for us to get a favourable wind? And the second bit is that there's a point in the Iliad where Agamemnon tells Achilles that he would very much like him as a son-in-law, and he points out that back home in Greece he has 3 daughters of marriageable age, Chrysothemis, Laodice and Iphianessa, no mention of Iphigenia. However, one poet who does know the myth of the sacrifice of the daughter of Agamemnon and uses it extensively is Aeschylus, who in the trilogy the Euripides told the story of the family of Agamemnon after he returned victorious from Troy. At the very beginning of the first play of the trilogy, which is called Agamemnon, the chorus describes the sacrifice of Iphigenia and how the goddess Artemis had to have her blood. And later on in the same play, after Queen Clytemnestra has killed Agamemnon, she explains her action to the chorus and admits that revenge for the slaughter of her daughter was her main motive. She says he sacrificed his own child, our daughter. He thought no more of it than killing a beast. And later on she has the famous phrase, axia drasas, axia paschon, and the literal translation of that would be he got what he deserved after what he did. In the following 2 books of the Euripides, Aeschylus also describes the story of Orestes, how Orestes, the son of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, returned to Mycenae and killed his mother in order to avenge the murder of his father. Immediately, he started being chased by the Erinyes, the Furies, the dreadful deities who were responsible for avenging homicides. And the trilogy finished on a rather happy note in Athens, where Orestes stands trial at the Areopagus, the Areopagus. He is acquitted, and the Erinyes are transformed into the Eumenides, the kindly goddesses who get their own cult in the city of Athens. In this play now, in the Iphigenia among the Taurians, Euripides plays around with this myth. He deconstructs it, to use a modern-sounding phrase. We first learn that Iphigenia wasn't really sacrificed in Aulis after all. At the last minute, the goddess Artemis put a deer in her place. The deer was slaughtered, and Iphigenia was transported to the land of the Taurians to become the priestess at the temple of Artemis. The Taurians have the following dreadful custom. Any foreigners who reach their shores are offered as a sacrifice to Artemis, and it is Iphigenia who was put in charge of these sacrifices. Orestes and Pylades now arrive in the land of the Taurians. Pylades is always the fellow traveller and companion of Orestes in tragedy. What has happened is that some of the Erinyes did not accept the decision of the court. They continue to follow and torment Orestes. In his desperation, he went back to Apollo to ask what he should do. The god replied that he should go to the land of the Taurians and bring back a statue of his sister, Artemis, that is to be found there. Once he brings the statue back to Athens, then all his troubles will be over. And do notice the two sets of brother and sister in the play. On the divine level, we have the children of Leto, Apollo and Artemis, and on the mortal level, we have Orestes and Iphigenia, the children of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, of course. Shortly after their arrival, Orestes and Pylades are arrested by the locals and are taken to Iphigenia to be sacrificed. Luckily, brother and sister manage to recognize each other before something horrendous happens. But the question now is how to effect their escape, and it is Iphigenia who comes up with a very clever plan. She tells Tauris, the king of the Taurians, that these two are polluted. They have committed the crime of matricide. They cannot be presented as a sacrifice to the goddess. She proposes to take them down to the shore herself to cleanse them along with the statue of the goddess. When they reach the shore, the three friends board the ship and are ready to depart for Greece. But, as in all this, the winds will not cooperate. A gale prevents them from leaving. And now King Tauris and his Taurians are on the verge of capturing them when Athena appears as the goddess from the machine, which is the technical term, and she resolves the issue. She orders Tauris to let the three Greek friends go, along with the women of the chorus, who are also Greek prisoners. The statue of Artemis will be taken to Ale in Attica, near modern-day Rafina, where the temple of Artemis Tauropolis will be built. And notice that the first half of Tauropolis is Taurus. And Iphigenia will become a priestess of Artemis in Vravrona, and after her death, she will become part of the Artemis cult. The families of women who die in childbirth will make offerings to her. Our first reaction would be that this tragedy isn't serious enough. Or another way of saying it is that it's not tragic enough, that it's not a normal tragedy. And scholars throughout the ages have tried to use different terms to describe exactly what this play is. They have called it a melodrama, they have called it a romantic tragedy, they have called it a romantic comedy, or even a tragic comedy. Something seems to be missing before we can call it a normal tragedy. But the question is exactly what is wrong with this play? One first answer would be to say, oh, you know what, it has a happy end, and a tragedy should not have a happy end. At the end of the Iphigenia, everybody survives, they're happy, and they go back home. But it is not clear at all that tragedies should definitely not have happy ends. The Oresteia, as I described it, has a happy enough ending, and another famous tragedy that doesn't finish in disaster is the Philoctetes of Sophocles, where the hero boards the ship and goes to Troy to help the Greeks conquer the city. And in fact, it is funny because Euripides' reputation in antiquity was exactly the opposite. His reputation was that he enjoyed catastrophic ends. He didn't like happy ends at all. A second criticism could be that the atmosphere is just not serious enough. There are humorous bits scattered around the play, and they set completely the wrong tone. An audience in a tragedy is not expected to laugh, especially not at the critical junctures of the plot. Take, for example, the very important point where Iphigenia tries to convince Tauris that she should take the prisoners down to the shore. She begins by telling him the statue switched position, and then Tauris replies, on its own, or has there been an earthquake? And a bit later on, he tells him that the two prisoners they have caught are polluted because they have committed the horrendous crime of matricide. And then Tauris, the barbarian king, says, oh, Phoebus, not even a barbarian would dare to do such a thing. At both of these points, it's very likely that we and the audience would laugh, and you wouldn't expect to laugh at the equivalent points in the Antigone or the Oedipus Rex. The other problem with this tragedy is that you just don't get the sense of inevitability that you expect in a good tragedy. In a good tragedy, you get the sense that necessity drives the plot. Each step follows the other with an almost mathematical precision. I mean, you get the feeling that Oedipus' fate was predetermined even before he was born, from when his father, King Laius, went to Delphi and asked for an oracle. Here it all seems too random, too haphazard. And to begin with, the myths that form the basis of the story don't make much sense, even by mythological standards. I mean, we're expected to believe that Artemis replaced Iphigenia with a deer, which I guess was plausible enough, it was within her powers. But then we're also expected to believe that no one noticed it, that Agamemnon slaughtered the deer and thought it was his daughter. And furthermore, this whole story about the Erinyes, the Furies, who do not accept the decision of the court and become freelance vigilantes, that also doesn't seem very convincing to me. But it's not only the sense of inevitability that's missing, there's also a sense of irrevocability that we would normally expect. We expect in a tragedy the irrevocable, that cannot be healed, that cannot be mended. You get the sense that heroes in tragedy, even when they survive, suffer something that will change their lives forever. But this story doesn't seem like the kind of thing that will change these heroes' lives forever. I mean, okay, it's a good story, the kind of story you tell to the grandchildren around the fireplace. I remember the time we're nearly caught by the Taurians, but there doesn't seem to be a fundamental shift in the way they view the world. I mean, to be honest, this is very much like a Hollywood action movie. The only thing missing would be the romance, and the only reason we haven't got romance is because Orestes and Iphigenia, of course, are brother and sister, and Pylades is already spoken for. He's married to the other sister, Electra, back in Mycenae. If you did have the romantic element, then this would be your typical adventure movie with the beautiful princess captured by the barbarians, and the dashing good guy comes, he rescues her, and then they disappear in the sunset, and we all live happily ever after. However, we should be very careful before we start calling the Iphigenia among the Taurians an Oresteia light, a rather carefree version of the myth. Because although the atmosphere may be a bit light, it's not as dark as some of the other plays, the treatment of the major issues is very serious. And when I say major issues, I'm talking about the major issues that every tragedy deals with. And these are the nature of God, the nature of fate, man's relation to God. For example, let's start with some comments Iphigenia makes right at the very beginning of the play. She says, I cannot say that I admire the goddess, because on the one hand, she will not allow polluted people near her altar, and by polluted, she means people who have come in contact with a corpse or who have come in contact with a woman who has just given birth. So the goddess, on the one hand, will not accept polluted people near her altar, but on the other hand, she accepts human sacrifices. But further down, Iphigenia casts doubt on whether it is the goddess herself who wants these human sacrifices. And she says, what I think happens is that the barbarians are the ones who are thirsty for blood. And they just attribute their vileness to the goddess. Now, both of these are very valid points. On the one hand, you have a mortal asking himself, what are the moral criteria of the gods? Do they expect the same things from us that they expect of themselves in their everyday behavior? And on the other hand, you get the very interesting observation, a very sophisticated observation, that maybe what human beings do is they project their own nasty thoughts and nasty urges onto the gods. And Orestes has some very interesting observations, some really thought-provoking observations that he makes in this play. When he starts describing what has happened to him, he says that he has been tricked by Phoebus, even though he's a prophet. And although he entrusted all his fortune to him, he made him kill his mother, and now he's going to be destroyed. But as the play progresses, we see that Orestes is more mellow towards the gods. For example, when he describes the second mission he was given to retrieve the statue from the land of the Taurians, he says the gods are more likely to support a man if he puts his heart into what he does. And when the three of them decide whether Artemis will be angry if they remove her statue from the land of the Taurians, Orestes makes a very valid observation that if that were the case, then her brother Apollo wouldn't have given him this mission. What I am trying to say is that this tragedy, Iphigenia among the Tauris, is asking all the same questions that every good tragedy should ask. Who are the gods? Are they fair? Do they have the same moral standards as we do? Do they want what is good for us? How can we know their will? And as with most good tragedies, the answers are far from obvious. And with this in mind, we should look at the surprise ending in a different light. Without the surprise ending, without Athena's appearance, this play would just be a reverse Oedipus Rex. In Oedipus Rex, you have a super smart guy who tries to use his intelligence to solve his problems and fight fate, and what happens is he messes up really badly, and in the end he is destroyed. In this play, you have Iphigenia, a very smart woman, who also tries to use intelligence to solve her problems. But the reason the gale is introduced and the reason why Athena has to intervene to save the friends is because Euripides is trying to say to us, look, at the end of the day, we live in a universe that we don't understand and we are subject to powers that we know nothing about. So yes, intelligence is really good and you're very lucky if you're smart, but you need to be pious and you need to have hope and faith that the gods will be on your side. Euripides is often mentioned as the most intellectual of the three great tragic poets. He was the one who was more attuned with the spiritual developments of his age. That was the era of the natural philosophers, the men who tried to find the laws that govern the universe. And it was also the era of the sophists, who for the first time started codifying and interpreting human laws and institutions. It is also said that Euripides was a close friend of Socrates, or at least that they moved in the same circles. And what is very interesting, at one point in the play, Orestes tells Pylades that if he allows himself to escape while his friend is sacrificed, everybody will accuse him for it and he will have to live in disgrace. And about 30 years later, in Plato's dialogue Crito almost makes the same point to Socrates in jail. He tells him that unless Socrates escapes, everyone in Athens will accuse his friends of failing to help him. So, bearing in mind this philosophical side of Euripides, it is very interesting to note how he treats the contrast between Greek and barbarian. And the first thing to note is that he has done his homework. If you read the part in Herodotus' histories where he describes the customs and the geography of the land of the Taurians, saying, for example, that they worship Iphigenia and that after they kill their enemies they impale their heads on big poles, it is obvious that Euripides uses detail from Herodotus to add local color to his story. And of course, the main difference between the Greeks and the Taurians in this play is that the Taurians still practice human sacrifice. They're still at that primitive stage of cultural evolution. But we saw earlier on how the king of Taurians, Thoas, is also critical against the Greeks when he says, "Oh, Phoebus, not even a barbarian, would have done such a thing," in answer to Iphigenia's point that these prisoners are matricides. And of course, Thoas' comment is doubly funny, not only because he criticizes the Greek prisoners, but because the god he uses in his oath, Phoebus Apollo, is exactly the same Greek god who has ordered Orestes to kill his mother in the first place. Later on, when the three friends are trying to figure out how to escape, Orestes asks the question, "Is there a way of killing the king?" And of course, Iphigenia replies, "What a monstrous idea, visitors killing their host." But of course, the audience would appreciate that the Taurians are the hosts who also have the monstrous practice of killing the visitors. And they will also notice that the Greek, Orestes, was prepared to discuss the idea if it was practical. It wasn't something that was outside the range of things that he was prepared to do. But it is not only the treatment of the contrast between Greek and barbarian that is interesting, but also the contrast between man and woman. It has been said of Euripides that he was a woman hater, or he was the first feminist, or that these two cancel out. And indeed, reading this play, we remain confused about what his real stance towards women was. On the one hand, in Iphigenia, he has created a very admirable, a very impressive heroine, a woman who is intelligent, brave, sensitive, noble, and caring. She begins by expressing some bitterness against those who are responsible for her position, people like Calchas and Odysseus and Helen, but in the end she has no bitterness even against the father who has slaughtered her. She's a very impressive, noble character. But still, throughout the play, there are scattered quotes that we today would call anti-feminist, anti-woman. For example, Orestes, when Iphigenia explains her plans to him, says, "Oh, women are adept at thinking up schemes." And later on, the messenger says, "Oh, how little trust one should put into women." So the question about what Euripides really thought about women is, I am afraid, still very much open. Here I would like to make two technical observations on the play. The first has to do with the scene of recognition. Recognition is a technical term in tragedy and refers in situations when people who don't know each other slowly discover each other's identity. And if you notice the recognition scene in this play, it is pretty long drawn. What seems to be the case is that audience loved this kind of thing. And Euripides, who at the time of writing was at the peak of his power, gives us a virtuoso performance about how one should present and direct such a scene. As an indication of how popular this scene was in antiquity, Aristotle, in his book of Poetics, mentioned it by name as a very good example of a model recognition scene. And what he likes is that it is very natural, that when Iphigenia finds out that the prisoners are from Mycenae, from Argos, she would like to send a letter to her brother. The second technical point I would like to make concerns the chorus. In earlier tragedy, chorus plays a very significant part. It is almost like an extra actor, and it is also responsible for expressing the views of the city, or at least of the group that it represents within the play, and illuminating certain aspects of the plot and presenting them from a mythological perspective. Now, in this play, the importance of the chorus is very much diminished. At the same time that Euripides was writing, another playwright called Agathon, who you will recognize Agathon if you read Greek philosophy, because he is the host at Plato's Symposium. Well, Agathon has started giving his choruses random songs to sing. So the same songs in the Agathon tragedy could be used in different plays or in different parts of the same play. Things with Euripides haven't quite reached that point. The choral loads in his play are relevant to the plot line. However, they are nowhere as important as in Aeschylus or in Sophocles. For example, you wouldn't dream of naming this play after the chorus. You wouldn't call it the Greek women prisoners, as is the case with earlier tragedy. Sometimes when talking about Euripides and when discussing his technical innovations or his peculiar religious outlook and his philosophical preferences, like we did before, it is very easy to fall into the trap of thinking of him as an avant-garde writer, as an equivalent of Beckett or Ibsen for the 5th century. But we have to remember that theatre in Athens was a religious ceremony subsidized by the state. It was part of the religious festival of Dionysus. The city itself paid for the actors and forced one rich citizen to pay for the chorus and for the other expenses of the production as part of the liturgy. So theatre was an activity of prime importance for the city, and Euripides was no maverick outsider. He was one of the central players of this very important activity for many decades. And it is interesting that in this play he takes his role as a religious teacher very seriously. He describes, for example, the establishment of the Temple of Artemis at Alais and the relevant religious festival in her honor, and also explains how Iphigenia was incorporated into the cult of Artemis at Vravrona. He also finds the roots of the festival of Coes in the myths of Orestes. So you have to remember that in ancient Athens there was no separate priestly class, and there was no sacred book that the audience could consult to learn these things. So here Euripides assumes the role of the educator, the teacher, especially a religious teacher, and he instructs his compatriots on the origins of festivals and customs that had survived until their day. I would like us to finish off with the following question. We said that this play has a happy end, but the question I would like to ask, if it is indeed a happy end for Iphigenia on the one hand and for Artemis and the statue on the other. We learn of Iphigenia that she will not go back to Mycenae to become a wife and a mother and a grandmother, as was the expectation of every Greek woman. She will become first a priestess of Artemis and then a cult figure herself, a figure to which people dedicate. Was this a happy end for man, living a life dedicated to God and then being elevated to the status of demigod? Or were the simple human joys of love, marriage, children, grandchildren preferable? And the reason I mention this is because this was the sort of question a tragic writer and a poet in general in ancient Greece was always keen to ask and to examine in his work. The second question I would like us to ask is whether this was a happy end for Artemis. It is mentioned in the plays that, of course, the goddess would prefer going to Athens than staying there in the land of the barbarians. And under normal conditions, that would definitely be the case. If you asked any Greek, is it preferable to live in a Greek city or in the land of the barbarians? Of course, he would say a Greek city, especially Athens. But we learned that this play was produced around 414, 413. And that was one of the darkest points in Athenian history. The front in Sicily had just collapsed, and within the next 10-15 years, not only would Athens lose the Peloponnesian War, but for the first time in a century, democracy would be overthrown. So one has to ask and wonder whether Euripides is being ironic when he describes Athens, the Athens of 414, 413, as a very happy place. This concludes today's episode of the Gikollias podcast on Iphigenia in the land of the Taurians. I would like to thank you very much for joining me, and I hope to speak to you soon. Bye bye.